Welcome, dear friends, to Highlights on the Book Action and Reaction. This week we will be reviewing Chapter 15. It is entitled Opportune Remarks. Leo, once again, what can we say about this?
We say that about every chapter.
We say about every chapter. It is amazing. It is a must-read chapter. We will not be able to touch on every aspect of this very deep chapter. Go and read it. Share it with your friends. This chapter is all about our sexuality. And it is interesting, Leo, throughout these weeks we have been studying, reading, listening to things, and getting a broader perspective on sexuality. You know, we live in what's called the post-feminism movement. We live in an era where, you know, back in the 60s there was one extreme and now we are living in another. So we, in accordance with the law of progress, we see that humanity is trying to find this balance. And it's amazing because in this chapter we find answers to things that are being dealt with in society now. Everything from contraceptives to abortion to the misuse to the abuse of our sexuality and the effects on the afterlife. What can happen to us as individuals and as a collective.
And one of the aspects that I would like to add to this is that Andre Luiz is studying with Silas on this case, feeding off of the case that we're studying on chapter 14, that is something so similar or that is happening in our lives nowadays, right? Yes. The family members that are coming back again and revisiting the problems of the past or engaging in the same problems of the past, and now they're learning about sexuality or the day-to-day lives. Based on that case. So it is very pertinent to all of us.
It is, Leo. That's really important because they open up discussing the case of Marcella and Roberto, which is, like you said, one of the previous chapters, the case of Edicei and his family, which basically the whole family is brought together. Why? Because in past life, each one had problems in sexuality, errors they had made. And so they're referring to actually the mother and the son, because the son, in the case of Edicei and his wife and 3 children, the father had a great disdain and aversion for the son, but the son and the mother had a very tight relationship. And Hilario, the one who asked most of the questions as we were discussing in this chapter, actually turns to Silas and asks him, well, is this a good example of the Oedipus complex? Which we know, according to Freud, which is when the son desires the mother and wants to push away or kill the father. And he says, well, not really. I mean, because Freud was so limited in his understanding, he only stuck to the physiological aspects of life. But if Freud, or if anybody really had studied the law of reincarnation, we would see it's much more profound than what meets the eye. Because really we learn in this chapter that there is responsibility to our sexuality, right, Leo?
And he said, it's funny because Silas, very interesting, says, you know, we cannot study this as if we were to study the sun from just like a little hole in the roof and look at the sun, which is this great thing that gives so much,
from the
exactly,
sun.
one little ray from the sun. So it's very important, as we say all the time, that you go and read, because this is a very liberating chapter when it comes down to sexuality. There are a lot of things that we cannot touch because of time, because we will be here for the whole time, for many, many hours, if anything. And again, it pushes us to study more. The Freud ideas, you know, all the ideas that comes along, and all the problems that we see nowadays. But again, the thing is, if you have any problems or any questions about sexuality, this is one of the chapters that we can touch on and we can feed off and then learn from it. But in this idea of understanding sexuality, how does he start? What does he say about it? Because Silas says, look, Freud is stayed in the unconscious, in the physical body. What would happen if he were to touch in the afterlife, right, or previous life? What would have happened?
No, Freud would have seen, much like people of Spiritists or non-Spiritists, anyone who adopts the who are reincarnationists, if we could put it that phrase, know that there's much more behind than just a physiological. It's not just this unconscious, because Freud believed that everything derived from the libido, from the sexual drive. And Silas, quite respectfully, he gives Freud credit, but he says that Freud needed to go more in depth, which means we need to go more in depth when we see problem areas in sexuality, even for ourselves, in whatever area. Most importantly, Leo, he explains, you know, this developmentally, how we, as children, as young adults, how we grow. That as children, we still have, under the age of 7, sort of this remnances and that sort of pop up, that manifests. And Dr. Ian Stevenson, of course we don't have time to go into his work that he did, but he saw the study, the research that he did for children that manifested these memories. And then as they got older, beyond age 7, they no longer manifested. So Silas sort of talks a little bit about that as well. So really they're telling us a lot in this opening part of sexuality. It's much more than what meets the eye. It's much more than pornography and the beautifulness of a woman. There's so much responsibility behind it, because Silas goes into explaining, because a lot of us asking questions like, well, what happens if a man, for example, misleads a woman, which is not uncommon, and vice versa? Right. Because he touches on both. He says, well, what happens if a man misleads a woman and then basically leaves her to despair, and she's stuck that way, and he moves on with his life? And he says, as this man dies, at some point he will recognize what he did. He will have to repair what he did. So we see there is responsibility. And for the women as well. I mean, they don't push it all on the guys. They also say there are women who do that. And so we see that every time we have a sexual partner, I mean, it seems like almost something it's taboo or people are scared to discuss, but there's a lot of responsibility in it. We should not be utilizing our body in such a loose way. You know, there's a great book, I believe, we have it here, Leo. It's entitled After the Storm by Joanna DeAngelis. There's a couple chapters, at least 1 or 2, she talks about sexuality, contraceptives, and it's amazing because she puts responsibility on the person, the individual.
It is a matter of growth as well. You know, as we go through these different reincarnations, we will understand better. And I think this is a great start if we have our doubts, if we have our questions nowadays, because there are many times Silas defines sex. He talks about sex in such a direct way, and it's a beautiful part that I would like to bring to all of you, page 199, besides many others, that he said, examine as an active force of life in light of the instance creation. Sex, strictly speaking, is expressed in all things, from the communion of subatomic principles to the attraction of the heavenly bodies, thus manifesting the power of love generated by the infinite love of God. Yes. So God has bestowed us with this idea of sex, this exchange of energy to co-create, right? And taken from that perspective, we see the importance of, like you said, making sure that we are realizing the drive, the feeling, sublimating our actions to really create something better within ourselves, thus creating something better for others too.
Leo, what he touches on, I'm so glad you brought that up, because basically what he's touching on is the law of reproduction. It's in the Spirit's book, part 3. There's many ways to reproduce, and in this chapter they also touch on that. They say that you know, Eladio actually makes a comment that he says that such reasoning would suggest that the sexual force is not meant only to produce children. And we know that this is a very somewhat controversial, because people have different ideas about this. So we know that Jesus, technically speaking, didn't have biological children, but he did fulfill the law of reproduction. They talk about this in this chapter. They talk about fulfilling that in so many words. If we read the law of reproduction, we see it matches perfectly because the sexual force is not solely meant to reproduce children. But Leo, I like what you said. You reminded us, because in every aspect of God's creation, from the subatomic particles to humankind, to our level, we reproduce. Why? Well, for instance, we're going to give you a very quick biology lesson. Atoms are like this. If one atom has, you can Google this later, dear friends. If one atom has something called 3 particles on its outside shell. An atom, a basic atom, always looks to have 8. So it has this sort of incessant drive. So it's constantly looking for another atom to complete itself. So we see that, so even in that minutest form of life, there is that drive. It's not an intellectual drive like you and I have, but it's a drive that they have to be complete, to reproduce, to create something more within itself. So we see that truly this is true. Anyone who does a little bit of studying, you don't have to be a biologist or a scientist. We are amazed at God's creation, right? Because everything has this driving force, and it's beautiful, right, Leo? I know that you're going to talk about that. What happens in more higher realms when you're more evolved?
Yes, we are now experiencing this drive in more humane or materialistic way, which is okay. The baby steps that we have to take to sublimate to get to a point where things will be much better. But it's interesting that he says that consequently, in accordance with the most sanctified stage of the spirit, higher minds, there is, and this is out my note, there is the pleasure of helping, finding pleasure in helping, discovering, purifying, redeeming, illuminating, studying, learning, growing spiritually, constructing, and an infinite number of other pleasures. This is the pleasure that higher minds are sublimating, that they're studying, that they're working together. And very interestingly, he also says that there are also associations of beings that are bound to one another by the purest sentiments on behalf of deeds of charity and education. That's the pleasure that they get when they're helping. That's what we see sometimes, the drive of Silas, for example. What kind of drive? You know, what drives him to do such a thing? What drive a group of people? We even see this in the planet right now. Individuals just giving themselves in such a noble way, but they find this pleasure. They find this pleasure. And for us who are very materialistic, or have a materialistic point of view, may find this very interesting to compare this to the pleasure that we find behind sex as well. So these are the things that we have to really sublimate and find, again, the pleasure behind all these things. And obviously, like I said, it's all baby steps.
So Leo, basically you're saying, we're paraphrasing what you're going to say, because you're paraphrasing what the book is saying. So what you're saying is that sex should be sublimated at some point. We should be working on sublimating those emotions. We will quote directly from page 201 that states the following, that we have this duty of emphasizing the fact that people's emotional experiences need to be sublimated. So we are in part emotional beings as well. We are comprised of this consciousness of emotions that express ideas and thoughts, which are who we are. So we need to work on these emotions because they are, like you said, there's baby steps. There's some who are over here who are still closer to the animalistic level of sexuality. There are some who are more evolved, who understand. For instance, there's a beautiful case that Divaldo Franco talks about in one of his lectures about, of course we don't have time to talk about all of it, but we just mentioned one little brief aspect of the case, not in its totality, but of a case of two people who both have AIDS. They do not engage in sexual contact, neither with one another because they're a couple. And when asked about that, they said that they had overcome that aspect of their lives and had gone to something much more profound with one another. That's amazing. So we know that therein lies the capability, like we mentioned about the acorn. I think before we started here today, we did our little prayer, and we read from Joanna about how out of a small acorn, I believe it is this big
oak tree.
So we see that we have the capability to sublimate these things. We have the ability within us, because we are created by God, to arrive at that point, to arrive at that perfection, because we were created ignorant and simple, but perfectible, right?
That is definitely right. And I think what we would add to this as well is to always look for our guiding motto as we started with Spiritism. You mentioned Jesus, as they brought Jesus here as well, to sublimate this idea of reproduction, of co-creating with others, finding pleasure on higher ideals, right? And if we have the doubt in our minds, or what sexuality, how should I treat my sexuality? They mention cases of inversion, of cases that, you know, what should we do if I don't feel, this body don't feel right for me? What is the reason behind it? Because there's a reason for everything. And sometimes we get ourselves caught up on something and we don't live our lives. We don't go on with our lives because we are so troubled. And here it is, a chapter in our hands that we can go and study and talk to friends, discuss, especially at our Spiritist Center when we have an open-minded group of people that we can talk about it. But again, never forgetting our guiding motto, our Jesus, who really sublimated this, who really exemplify all these things. So we hope that this, with this message in this chapter, that you study, that you work with your partners or your friends, and you can live a better life, because it's truly helpful. Until next time, until next chapter, and we'll see you again.
Many blessings.